So for this episode, we've got something a little different because we still have a guest, but it's you.
Uh-oh.
So we wanted to talk about, because you had an experience last year, which was really interesting, because you were working on a TED Talk about a year ago about evaluating large language models.
Mm-hmm.
And then things changed.
Things got kooky.
Things changed in a really big way.
Yeah, and things change in tech a lot. I mean, we're used to change, but this was, I would say, the world sat up and took notice.
That sounds a little exhausting.
Yeah. But I mean, I think it depends on the kind of person you are. Like, I like the excitement of change. I'm the kind of person who I enjoy starting things, and it's the finishing of things that makes me, that I have to like pull myself to do. So I like big change. I like excitement. This was intense, but in general, being flexible and being ready for big change, I think, is an important thing when you work in tech.
Yeah, so can you let us know what happened? It's the end of November 2022.
Right.
Working on this.
I had been working on the script for a while. So I had got the news that I was accepted to do a TED Talk at this Destination Canada event. So it was all Canadians coming together to do a TED Talk. So it was really cool. I had been working on a script, and I don't know if you remember what happened at the end of November in AI, but the world changed, and ChatGPT was released.
Oh.
And we had been planning a particular kind of TED Talk about evaluating large language models. And then in the wake of ChatGPT, it just didn't seem to make sense anymore to talk about how these ways that we still use to evaluate large language models, I think to the general public, just didn't seem consistent with what they had started to see.
How much of it did you have to change?
Yeah, so to set the stage, we had been working on the script, and the idea was that it should be finalized in sort of mid-January. And ChatGPT came out at the end of November, so really the ruckus started early December. I had basically an entire script written at that point and was starting to get into the process of creating graphics and talking about how we would memorize it, and then we had to just completely change the plan. We realized that the script that we had been writing was about how we evaluate models, but to the general public, ChatGPT was just so good. It kind of, the ways that I had been describing about how to evaluate models just didn't really seem consistent with that. And so it was just really clear to us that we would have to change the direction of the TED Talk. And this was mid-December. And so we were supposed to have a finalized script by mid-January. And of course, what happens between mid-December and mid-January? Everyone goes on holiday for at least a week, right?
Yeah.
The world shuts down. So it's not even a month that we had to basically rewrite this script from scratch, because the TED Talk itself was at the end of February. And you do need a bit of time to get everything in order to work towards that.
No, so it was a real crunch to kind of meet this deadline while adjusting to all the changes that have been made.
And of course, it felt like constant updates and changes that whole time. It wasn't like ChatGPT came out and everybody used it once and then stopped talking about it. I did something like 30 media interviews between January and May of 2023. It was absolute pandemonium, and ChatGPT kept getting updated so it could do more. It was just, there was a lot of excitement, and it felt like every time we turned around there was a new story, and it just people weren't sure if what was going to happen with work and jobs, and there was just a lot of discussion, and it really felt like the earth was continually shifting under our feet during the time we were putting that together.
I remember that part because we kind of helped manage some of the media requests, and it seemed like every 3 hours it was oh, email Alona, say she's free for another one. All over the place.
Yeah, and I like talking about that stuff, and I was excited that people were excited about what we had, the community had been working on. But it also was hard to sort of feel like you had your footing. I felt like every time the media wanted to talk to you, it was because something crazy had happened again. And it was literally weekly. So it was every week was a new thing.
So, when you're saying that these old evaluation methods, they didn't seem to fit as much before, how did that used to work? What were those old ways that don't make sense anymore?
Yeah, so the original script sort of walked through the progression of how we have been evaluating language models starting from the 2010s, sort of walking through to the ways we do it more recently. The general idea is to try to figure out a way to measure whether a language model understands what you're saying. And the tests start with single words. if you think about it, we do also sometimes want to know if people understand single words, and we actually do test them, and we get scores. You're probably familiar with some of those tests, like the SAT or the GREs. These are tests people take all the time to figure out how deep their vocabulary knowledge is.
Like the ones where you have to read, like, here's a story to read. What did the bunny do?
Right.
Having to do a lot of those.
Or even simpler ones. So there's like the analogy one, like hammer is to nail as screwdriver is to
screw.
Excellent job.
All right.
You're passing your SAT. So
I didn't know there'd be a quiz today.
Well, I mean, you should be able to perform like a language model.
All right. Well, it's a lot of pressure for Friday morning where we're recording.
Yeah. Anyway, so basically the idea was you can take these tests that have already been written and repurpose them in order to test like language models. And that's what they did. So they took these analogy tests. They took the ones from the SATs, these analogies. There's also like man is to king as woman is to queen. And so they would give the language model a question like that. And then along with the answer queen, which is correct, they would give other answers like boy or court jester. You could imagine multiple different answers. And the language model has to choose amongst them. And that is the kind of technique that we had to start with. So first of all, evaluating single words, because early on, we didn't have what we call now contextual models. We had models that really only understood words in isolation.
Okay.
They didn't understand how to put words together, really. And so the tests were built for that, but the tests were also built in a way so that they were multiple choice. So we have to choose amongst a set of options. There's 4 possible answers to the man is to king as woman is to whatever. And the model has to choose amongst the 4. So everything when we started out also had to be a multiple choice question. Also a great place to start with SATs and GRE questions, because that's exactly what they are too.
Okay. But I mean, it kind of strikes me that that's not the way that people use language, right? Like that's not how you understand language. It's not single words. It's not multiple choice.
That was definitely the starting point. And of course, we have to start somewhere when we start testing AI models. And so they started simple with single words. But you're right, the next step is, of course, to try to work beyond single words. And the next obvious step is sentences. So the idea behind one of the other tests that was developed is that we would give a language model 2 sentences and then ask it to answer some sort of multiple choice question about those 2 sentences. So this particular data set gives people 2 sentences, and then you have to decide if the 2 sentences are consistent, contradictory, or if the relationship between the 2 is neutral. So an example would be a sentence like, an audience looks on as a woman gives a talk.
Okay.
A consistent sentence would also describe something such that if the first sentence was true, the second sentence could also be true. So the second sentence could be, an audience looks on as a person gives a talk. So if a woman's giving a talk, it is also true that a person is giving a talk.
Okay. And you can tell that second sentence is true because of the information you have from
the first one is true. Yeah. And then a contradictory sentence could be, there are no women on stage. So if an audience looks on as a woman gives a talk and there are no women on stage, those 2 things don't make sense. So those 2 sentences are contradictory.
Okay.
And now we have left to explain is a neutral sentence. And an example of that would be, an audience looks on while a woman gives a talk about mitochondria. If a woman's giving a talk, she may or may not be talking about mitochondria. That's a piece of information we don't have, so that's neutral. It is neither consistent nor contradictory.
All right, so it's almost kind of just extra information.
Right, yeah. Additional information that we can't tell is or is not true if the first sentence is true.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's nice. It's a nice test because you have to understand the 2 sentences in order to answer the question, and the question is still a multiple choice question, which is nice. For computers at the time, we're better at handling multiple choice questions. I think computers at the time could do in like the high 80s on these tests. So you're choosing one of 3 options. Chance would be 33%. And it was, high 80s. So it was pretty clear that, computers understood the meaning of these words.
Yeah, it sounds like a pretty impressive rate.
Yeah. So you're impressed?
Yes.
Oh, Scott. It's sad that poor Scott. You've been fooled by the language models. Probably not for the first time and not the last time. All of us have all been fooled by language models, not just you. So it turns out that the way that this test is structured, language models could answer it with above chance accuracy if you only gave them the second sentence and they had no access to the first. And that's because there's sort of hints of information in that second sentence that allow you to answer the multiple choice question. So you don't even need the first sentence in order to tell if the second sentence is consistent, contradictory, or neutral.
Okay. So then what was the model used? Like, how did it figure out and get this 80%?
Yeah, so it turns out that there's little hints in the sentences. So a sentence is often consistent if it's more general. So remember, our consistent sentence was an audience looks on as a person gives a talk. So consistent sentences often have more general language like person or animal or, plant instead of a specific kind of plant, or a general place rather than a city. So if there was more general language rather than more specific language, that's a good sign that this sentence is consistent, even though you have no idea what the first sentence is.
So it wasn't so much it was reading and understanding the sentence. It's more it's picking up on certain patterns, certain words, and then making sort of an educated guess.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And there's similar patterns. So for example, the neutral sentences often have additional pieces of information. So the sentences often have like a little thing tacked on at the end. And that's another sign that what you've got here is a neutral sentence, because that little additional piece of information could or could not be consistent with the first sentence, even though you don't know what the first sentence is. So it turns out that the language models were leveraging information that is it's correlated to the task, but of course, it's not actually the task. We're not asking the language model, please tell us if there's a more general word in this sentence. That's not the task. Rather, it's using that piece of correlated information to do the task.
And it sounds like the kind of thing that could get confused if you tried like a little bit of a tricky sentence, or people phrase things in different ways.
Right, yeah. And so it's using a piece of information that, could be important for the task, but it's not exactly the task itself. Right. And I give that example because I want to make clear that testing language models is not simple. Setting these tests up properly takes real thought, and you have to be thinking about not just what you wanted to test, but also what you do not want the language model to be using to do the test, and make sure that you have controlled for these other variables, like additional pieces of signals about the kind of information being given.
Okay. And I guess I'm trying to think of how you set up a test, but we as people use language so freely and easily that once you actually have to start thinking about it, it becomes like really complicated and really overwhelming, kind of.
Yeah. So, psycholinguistics is an area that has been thinking about how to test people's understanding of language. And they have been working on this for, decades, trying to make these beautiful, well-controlled tests so that they know exactly the thing that they're testing is the only thing that, or is as close to as they can get to being the only thing that differs between the conditions. There's actually a lot of really neat overlap between what people have been doing to study language in humans and what people have been using to study language in language models. And that continues to this day. There's some cool work with developmental psychology trying to figure out what ChatGPT can do using tests that we actually used on infants, decades ago. Yeah.
And how does that stack up? Do we know?
So it turns out that ChatGPT has some problems with reasoning. It doesn't reason the same way that a child does, but it actually, adults actually don't reason the same way other children do, which is also kind of fun.
So we've been trying to get away from multiple choice questions?
You can think back to the tests we were talking about. They are multiple choice questions. And of course, we love multiple choice questions because they're easy to grade, but they can be really restrictive. What we would prefer to have is to have the language model actually answer with words. Yeah. And so new tests were developed where the language model had to, actually answer an actual question with words. So the way these tests work is that the language model is given some context. So like a sentence or a short paragraph, kind of like from Wikipedia is a great example. Actually, a lot of the original tests were built by scraping stuff out of Wikipedia. So the language model is given a little bit of context, like a couple sentences from Wikipedia, and then a question. And then the language model has to answer. The original form of this task was that the answer was a word or two in the context.
Okay. An
example would be, in meteorology, precipitation is when condensed atmospheric water vapor falls under gravity. It's kind of a mouthful, but remember, we're scraping from Wikipedia. And a question could be, what causes precipitation to fall? And if you remember back, the answer is gravity. And so that word itself actually appears in the context. And so the task for the language model is sort of to highlight that word in the context in order to answer the question.
Okay. So the answer is within the information you gave them, and it has to find it out in that larger sentence.
Yeah. And so this was a huge data set created. It's called the Squad data set. And it, received a lot of excitement and interest because it was, this new task, question answering, where the language was from Wikipedia. So it's often quite technical. And so a lot of the questions were, difficult.
How good are they at going through that context and finding the correct answer?
Current language models are about 90%, which, is about as well as people could do on the task.
I'm not sure if I'm supposed to be impressed by that number now, but
because I tricked you previously.
Yeah, is it good?
So one of the drawbacks is that the task is to find the word in the context that answers the question. But if the question is unanswerable given the context, the language model has no way to say that, no way to communicate that to the user. So they had to go back and redo this data set in order to create unanswerable questions so that the language model, instead of saying, if you asked it like, what's the capital of Syria, but we had like the context was the thing about precipitation, it would have to choose a word, right?
So it needed to answer, and it couldn't say.
It couldn't say, I don't know. Which that might be hard to believe given how often Alexa probably tells you, I'm sorry, I don't know that one.
I get that one a lot.
Yeah, it happens a lot. But believe it or not, that was hard to get language models to do, to say, I don't know. So they went back and they redid the data set and they put in unanswerable questions. So for every one of the contexts, they would include some questions where the answer did not appear in the context. And it actually took a while for people to get AI to perform well again. It took about 2 years to conquer that task, which I think tells you how hard it is to get a language model to understand when it doesn't know.
Yeah. And I imagine that's pretty important. Like if you're using it as a research tool or to scan a large document, if it doesn't tell you, if it doesn't know something, it just gives you an answer, that can cause a lot of trouble really quickly.
Yeah. So I think people have seen this with ChatGPT. If you ask ChatGPT to tell you about a person who isn't extremely famous, it will tell you about that person and it will probably get things incorrect. So when ChatGPT first came out, the professors in my department really enjoyed asking ChatGPT to describe who they are. Because although there is a trace of them on the internet, they are not all very famous. Or they're famous in their own circles, but maybe not internet famous. And so ChatGPT will tell you a little bit about Professor so-and-so, but some of it will be true and then other parts of it will be false. It told one of our professors that he had passed away.
Oh, okay.
Poor guy. He didn't even know.
I actually went an exercise with some friends when ChatGPT came out. Was we asked it to write bios about us from stuff we would find, and I was surprised to know that I was the editor of a major newspaper.
Oh wow!
Yeah,
and haven't been paying you.
Haven't been paying me, but that's okay because I haven't been doing much work for them.
It's like those nightmares you have where you're like, oh my god, I forgot to go to that class all semester. It's like, oh my god, I forgot to be the director of a major newspaper.
Yeah, on that note, because I'm more familiar, like most people, with using ChatGPT, and when you put it in, it gives you complete sentences. It's not this single word thing that you're describing. How did that change happen? Why can that happen now?
Yeah, so language models have continued to progress, and now they don't have to answer multiple choice questions. They can do more than that. They can also do more than highlighting a word in a context. They can create free-form replies to questions. But that is actually much more difficult to evaluate because you can imagine for any question, especially the sorts of questions that people ask ChatGPT, there are many, many correct answers, right? Yeah. And some of them might not even overlap very much in the words that they contain, right? Depending on the actual question that's been asked. OpenAI went to a lot of trouble to sort of allow ChatGPT to learn that there are many ways to answer a question, and some of them are better than others, but a lot of them are basically interchangeable. So they spent some time implementing what they called reinforcement learning with human feedback. And that technique required them to have a whole bunch of people annotate responses. So for a given question, they would have ChatGPT versions and give a bunch of different responses, and they would have people say which one is better, which one is the best. And
it's a good answer. That one doesn't make sense.
Right. Or this one makes a little bit more sense than this one. Sort of like a ranking of responses. And it turns out that information, that ranking of responses, was also really helpful for ChatGPT to learn to create responses that were diverse, but also, good. Now that we have models that can generate sentences, they can answer questions, and actually in some cases even ask questions. Now we have multiple language models that can kind of talk to themselves, play amongst themselves, and that's something my lab is working on, getting a language model to generate questions to sort of extract information from another language model. So we have these like large language models trained on the internet. If you have another model that knows how to ask questions of that model to get out information that's necessary, then you can have a better performance on some tasks.
Okay, so it's kind of chatting with itself.
There was, I think, a video circulating where they had like an Alexa and a Google Home talking to each other. Yeah, so it's sort of like that, except, virtual inside of a computer. Like, thankfully, we don't have to listen to that as it happens. And, millions and millions of conversations happening behind the scenes so that these two models can learn to work together.
Okay, so you're just giving it, just flooding it with data, it sounds like, to train it.
Yeah, and getting the models to interact with each other so that the model that's asking the questions sort of learns how to ask questions of this other language model.
So then with this big shift, you have to talk about how we evaluate these models, and the answer has changed from under you.
Yeah, so all of what I described today, especially the stuff at the beginning of what we were talking about with the single words and the multiple choice questions, kind of seems kind of hokey, right?
Yeah.
And a little bit inconsistent with what we now know about ChatGPT.
I mean, I don't want to be dismissive of what sounds like very hard work, but once you have something that can sound like a person, being a multiple choice, it's not very impressive,
right?
It seems.
Right. And I mean, truthfully, the reason the SATs uses multiple choice questions is because it's easy to mark them. Yeah. It's not because that's the best way to evaluate a language model, or a person, I should say. When ChatGPT was released, it seemed like the TED Talk that we had been working on about this evolution of how evaluation of language models had changed over time, though to me, I think is still a fun and interesting conversation. I'm glad we're having it today. It did seem like to the general public, it might not be so timely. It might seem a little out of touch with what was actually happening. And so we took a moment and we sort of reevaluated where we were and how we might change what we had developed in order to be more forward-looking, to develop a TED Talk that was maybe something that might be more timely, more evergreen.
And what was that shift? Like, what did you end up focusing on?
So all of the tests that we talked about today are heading towards this big question of, do language models understand us? And sort of setting up a bunch of different tasks in order to try to answer that question. But all of them are trying to answer that core question. Does this language model actually understand what's going on in this bit of language? And then over many, many pieces of language, maybe we can answer the bigger question, does it understand language in general?
I mean, that seems to be the crux of what we want to get at, right? That's the ultimate question.
But it's a hard question to answer. So to you and I, it seems easy because most of the language using entities we deal with day to day understand language, and it's pretty clear. And, there's not a lot of like people walking around using a language without knowing what it means. For the most part, we can trust that if somebody is using language, they understand language. And so thinking about how to evaluate that is, it's a tricky thing to think about. And it also opens up these questions about like, how would you even know? If you were interacting with ChatGPT and it was conversing with you in a way that was completely human-like, it's using language in a very natural way, how do you know if it's doing language like people are? How do you know if it understands like we are? And that gets back to some of the psycholinguistic stuff we talked about, some of the development experiments that we talked about where people are trying to run those experiments on language models. That is really what they're trying to do. They're trying to use some of what we had used previously on humans in order to test language models, but we might be able to answer it in a slightly different way. Like if we could see inside of the language model and what it's actually doing, we might be able to answer that question in like a more faithful, grounded way. So if we can see what the language model is doing, say like inside of the neural network, and compare that to what a person is doing in their brain, we might be able to say more concretely whether the two entities are doing the same thing when reading the same sentence.
Sort of get around the problem we talked about earlier where it's just, I just saw a pattern and I'm aping the pattern, not actually understanding, like you said.
Right, yeah. So it kind of gets at the very deepest questions about what it means to understand language. And we get into the Chinese room argument in the TED Talk, but I will leave that to the TED Talk to describe.
Yeah, that sounds stressful. That sounds like a stressful time. We had worked together a little bit while you were practicing your TED Talk, but I had no idea that it was this much of a shift that you had to deal with? I mean, it sounds kind of like the world changed and then you have to catch up.
Yeah, and so it was kind of a serendipitous time to be putting together a TED Talk. It was a cool moment to be talking about language models because it really did seem like the whole world was just itching for content about language models. And they did warn me after we recorded the TED event, they did warn me that they were going to try to turn that talk around really quickly and get it out. So it was one of the first ones to come out after that event because everybody was so excited about language models. But there was also that pressure leading up to it that it was very clear that everyone was sort of waiting. And if anybody had anything to say about language models, there was going to be some attention for that. So, I mean, it was also well-timed for the TED Talk because it did do quite well view-wise, and partially because of when it was released.
Yeah, it came at a really opportune moment and a time when I think a lot of people, myself included, were seeing this really transformative technology and wanted to know more about it.
Yeah, so I mean, if had it come out 2 years earlier, not only would it have been a different TED Talk, it probably would have received very different attention. It was, happy accident.
It kind of strikes me it also is an indicator of how quickly things move in AI and how things can change. Like we've seen a lot of development and a lot more interest in the last few years. And it really seems like that just keeps, like, that's not slowing down, that's continuing. So from your perspective as somebody who's been working in a field like natural language processing, is that kind of the sense you get as well?
Yeah, I think things are ramping up. There continues to be a lot of interest. I think people are now thinking about, now that these language models are so powerful, what can we do with them? What's the task that this language model can now do that it couldn't do previously? And so I think, language models are going to continue to get better, but I think the big innovations now are going to come from how people dream up ways to use language models, not just to create terrible books and put them on Amazon, but also who knows what other more interesting things.
Yeah, maybe something a little more productive, hopefully.
Amazon hopes so, I'm sure.
Yeah. It's one of those things that, like I said, we had kind of worked a little bit before, but I had no idea. So thank you for kind of giving a peek into how that whole process happened. It's really interesting to hear what you learned along the way.
Yeah.
And I'm going to be honest, I'm going to be thinking now when I'm talking with somebody a little differently about how that language works.
And also, like, do they actually understand language, or are they just an AI?
Yeah. And then, of course, I mean, if you haven't seen Alona's TED Talk, it's fantastic. I really enjoyed it. We will put the link into the description of this video, so you can check it out as well. I'll probably be watching it again today, to be honest with you.
Yeah, thanks for letting me tell the story of the TED Talk that never got to be.
Yeah.
I appreciate that.
That was fantastic.
Yeah, thanks, Scott.